My name is Whisper Johnson, and at 81 years old, I need to tell you something that's been eating at my soul for 65 years now. When I was 16, I married 2 men at the same time. Conjoined twins. And they made me their prisoner for 3 years, forcing themselves on me 8 times a day until I thought I'd die from. I know what you're thinking. You're thinking this old woman's lost her mind, sitting here in my little house on Elm Street with my tea getting cold and my cat purring on the windowsill. You're thinking maybe the years have scrambled, my memories like eggs in a pan. But I'm telling you the God's honest truth, and every word of it is burned into my heart like a brand. I'm Whisper Johnson, though that wasn't always my name. Most folks around Iron Kettle, Missouri, know me as the widow who keeps to herself, tends her small garden, and shows up to church every Sunday with a covered dish for the potluck. They see an old woman who's lived a quiet life. Maybe a little too quiet, maybe a little too careful about keeping her curtains drawn and her past locked away tighter than a bank vault. But I wasn't always this careful. I wasn't always this quiet. There was a time when I was just a scared girl with nowhere to go and no one to turn to. And I made a choice that I thought would save me. Instead, it nearly destroyed everything I was and everything I could have been. I've kept this story buried so deep for so long that sometimes I wondered if it really happened at all. But the scars don't lie. The memories don't fade. And the sound of a door locking still makes my hands shake like autumn leaves in a storm. I reckon it's time I told someone the whole truth from the very beginning to the very end. Because carrying this alone has been like trying to hold back a river with my bare hands. So settle in with me if you will. Let me take you back to 1959 when I was just 16 and thought I knew what love was supposed to look like. Let me tell you about Jacob and Elias Gable and how what started as salvation turned into the longest nightmare of my life. And maybe, just maybe, if you listen to every word I have to say, you'll understand how a person can survive the impossible and still find a way to call it living. You have to understand something about Iron Kettle, Missouri in 1959. It was the kind of place where everybody knew everybody's business, but some secrets were so dark that folks pretended they didn't exist at all. The Gable twins were one of those secrets. They lived up on Mockingbird Hill Inn, that big white house that used to belong to their grandparents. And most people in town acted like that house was empty, like those boys had never been born at all. But I knew they existed because I'd seen them once when I was maybe 12 years old. I was walking past the Mercantile with Mrs. Hicks. She was the lady who took me in after my mama died, and I caught a glimpse of them through the back window of old Mr. Abernathy's delivery truck. 2 grown men sharing one body from the waist down, sitting there quiet as church mice while Mr. Abernathy loaded their groceries. Mrs. Hicks yanked my arms so hard I thought she'd pull it clean off and told me never to stare at God's mysteries, that some things weren't meant for young eyes. See, I was an orphan, you understand. Had been since I was 10 when my mama caught the consumption and wasted away to nothing in the space of 6 months. My daddy had run off when I was just a baby. So when Mama died, I became what they called a ward of charity. Mrs. Hendricks took me in, but it wasn't out of kindness. The county paid her a little something each month, and I earned my keep doing the cooking and cleaning and mending. She wasn't cruel exactly, but she wasn't warm either. Love was a luxury we couldn't afford in that house. By the time I turned 16, Mrs. Hicks was making it clear that my time under her roof was coming to an end. The county payments would stop when I turned 18, and she had her own troubles to worry about. She'd started talking about finding me suitable employment, which in a town like Iron Kettle meant working in somebody's kitchen or maybe cleaning rooms at the boarding house if I was lucky. If I wasn't lucky, well, there were other kinds of work that desperate girls sometimes had to consider. That's when Reverend Morrison came to see Mrs. Fricks with what he called a proposition from God himself. I was in the kitchen making biscuits for supper when I heard their voices drifting through the thin walls, low and serious like they were, discussing funeral arrangements. The Reverend, he told Mrs. Fricks, that the Gable family had made an unusual request. They were looking for a young woman to marry their boys, both of them legal and proper before God and the state of Missouri. It wasn't unheard of, the Reverend said, in cases like theirs, where nature had bound two souls in one body. The law allowed for it under special circumstances, and the church would sanctify it as long as all parties were willing and of age. The Gables were offering a generous sum to whoever would help arrange such a marriage, enough money to set Mrs. Hendricks up comfortable for years to come. And they were specifically requesting someone young, someone who could adapt to their particular situation, someone who wouldn't be frightened away by their condition. I remember standing there, with flour on my hands, listening to them talk about me like I was livestock being sold at auction. My whole future being decided by two people who saw me as nothing more than a problem to be solved and a check to be cashed. Mrs. Fricks called me into the parlor that evening after the Reverend left. She sat me down in the good chair, the one with the blue flowers that I was usually forbidden to even touch, and explained the situation with the kind of careful words you use when you're trying to make something terrible sound reasonable. The Gable twins, she said, were good Christian men who'd been dealt a difficult hand by the Almighty. They owned considerable property, had money in the bank, and could provide for a wife in ways that few men in Iron Kettle could manage. It would be a marriage of convenience, she said. But convenience was better than charity, and charity was all I could expect otherwise. What she didn't say, what hung in the air between us like smoke from a dying fire, was that I didn't really have a choice. At 16, with no family, no money, and no prospects, I could either accept this proposition or find myself on the street. Come my 18th birthday, I asked her if she'd ever seen them herself, and her face went pale as milk. She told me that some things in this world were God's business, not ours, and that a good Christian woman learned to accept what the Lord provided without questioning His wisdom. And that's when I knew that whatever was waiting for me up on Mockingbird Hill was going to change everything about who I was and who I thought I could become. The first time I met Jacob and Elias Gable, I thought I was looking at a miracle and a curse, all wrapped up in one body. It was a cold Tuesday morning in November when Reverend Morrison drove me up that winding dirt road to Mockingbird Hill. The trees were bare as bones, and the wind cut through my thin coat like it was made of paper. I remember how my hand shook, not from the cold but from something deeper, something that felt like standing at the edge of a cliff and knowing you were about to jump. Their house was bigger than I'd expected. White clapboard and green shutters with a wraparound porch that had seen better days. Paint was peeling here and there, and some of the floorboards sagged a little, but it was still the finest house I'd ever been inside. When we knocked, it took a long time for anyone to answer, and I could hear shuffling footsteps and low voices discussing something I couldn't make out. When the door finally opened, I saw them for the first time up close and I had to remind myself to breathe. They were joined at the hip and shared legs, but from the waist up, they were two completely different men. Jacob was on the left side. He was the one who opened the door. And he had dark hair that curled a little at the ends and brown eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. His face was kind with smile lines around his eyes that told me he laughed sometimes, even if he didn't have much reason to. Elias was quieter, with lighter hair that was always a little messy, and blue eyes that seemed to see right through to your soul. He hung back a little when they walked, like he was letting Jacob take the lead in most things. The Reverend made the introductions, and Jacob reached out to shake my hand, while Elias nodded politely, but didn't say much of anything. Jacob's hand was warm and calloused, working hands, not soft like you might expect from men who lived in isolation. When he smiled at me, something in my chest fluttered like a bird trying to find its way out of a cage. They invited us in for coffee, and I found myself in their kitchen watching Jacob move around with a grace that seemed impossible given their condition. They'd learned to work together so seamlessly that it looked almost like a dance. When Jacob reached for the coffee pot, Elias was already leaning in the same direction. When Elias wanted to add sugar to his cup, Jacob's hand was already moving toward the bowl. It was like watching two people who shared not just a body but a mind. The house smelled like old wood and coffee and something else I couldn't quite place. Maybe lavender or the kind of soap that comes in fancy bars. There were books everywhere stacked on tables and shelves, and I realized these weren't ignorant men despite what the town might think. Jacob told me they'd been educated by tutors who came to the house, that they'd read everything from Shakespeare to the Bible to farming almanacs. Elias mentioned that they particularly loved poetry, and when he recited a few lines from memory, his voice was soft and musical in a way that made my heart do funny things. They asked me about myself, what I liked to read, if I enjoyed cooking, whether I'd ever lived on a farm. Jacob did most of the talking, but I noticed that Elias watched my face carefully when I answered, like he was memorizing every expression. They seemed genuinely interested in what I had to say, which was more attention than anyone had paid me in years. When they showed me around the house, I saw how they'd adapted everything to work for them. Their bed was larger than normal with extra pillows for support. The kitchen had been modified so they could cook comfortably together. There was even a special chair in the sitting room that accommodated their shared body while giving each of them space to read or work on separate projects. But what struck me most was how gentle they were with each other and how gentle they were with me. When Jacob accidentally bumped into a doorframe, Elias immediately asked if he was hurt. When I stumbled a little on the stairs, they both reached out to steady me at the same time. These weren't the monsters that the whispered stories in town had made them out to be. They were just two men who'd been dealt an impossible hand by fate and were trying to make the best of it. Before we left that day, Jacob asked if I would consider coming back to visit again, maybe staying for dinner so we could get to know each other better. Elias added that they understood this was a difficult situation for everyone involved, but they hoped I might find it in my heart to give them a chance to prove they could make me happy. Driving back down that hill with Reverend Morrison, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Wanted. Not needed, not tolerated, but genuinely wanted. For the first time since my mama died, someone was looking at me like I mattered, like I was precious instead of just another burden to bear. I didn't know then that being wanted and being treasured were two very different things, and that sometimes the line between love and possession is so thin you can't see it until you're already trapped on the wrong side. I started visiting the Gable house 3 times a week after that first meeting, and each time I climbed that hill I felt like I was walking deeper into a dream I wasn't sure I wanted to wake up from. Mrs. Hicks would pack me a small lunch and remind me to mind my manners, but I could see the relief in her eyes every time I left. She was already counting the money she'd receive once the marriage was finalized. The brothers had a way of making me feel like I was the most important person in the world. Jacob would have fresh flowers waiting for me. Wild flowers he'd somehow managed to pick from their garden, arranged in a mason jar on the kitchen table. Elias would have selected a poem to read aloud, his voice soft and careful with each word, like he was giving me a gift wrapped in syllables. They remembered everything I told them. How I liked my coffee, that I was afraid of thunderstorms, that my mama used to sing hymns while she did the washing. But it was the little things that started to change first, so gradual I almost didn't notice. When I mentioned that I enjoyed reading, Jacob brought out a book of poetry that had belonged to their mother and told me I could borrow it for as long as I liked. But when I tried to take it home, Elias suggested it might be better if I read it there, where the light was better, where I could ask them questions if I didn't understand something. It made sense at the time. When I admired the piano in their sitting room, an old upright that had seen better days but still held its tune, they both lit up like Christmas morning. Jacob told me their mother had played, that the bench was adjustable, and the sheet music was still in the bench. Elias wondered if I might like to learn, if perhaps I could practice when I visited. Before I knew it, they'd arranged for me to come every day so I wouldn't lose momentum with my lessons. Every day became twice a day when Jacob mentioned how much they both looked forward to my visits. How the hours between my leaving and returning felt longer than entire seasons. Elias worried that I wasn't eating enough, that Mrs. Hicks wasn't taking proper care of me. Why didn't I stay for breakfast as well as dinner? They had plenty of food, plenty of room, and wouldn't it be easier than walking back and forth so much? I started staying overnight on weekends, sleeping in their guest room with the yellow wallpaper and the white iron bed that creaked when I turned over. They were perfect gentlemen, never once made me feel uncomfortable or unsafe, but I began to notice how they watched me, how their eyes followed me when I moved around the house, how they both went quiet when I mentioned anything about my life back in town. The shift happened so slowly that I can't pinpoint exactly when I realized I was no longer visiting the Gable house. I was living there. Few possessions had migrated from Mrs. Hendrick's place bit by bit. My Sunday dress hung in their closet because it was easier than carrying it back and forth. My hairbrush sat on their bureau because I'd forgotten it one too many. The book I was reading stayed on their nightstand because, after all, this was where I did most of my reading. Now Mrs. Hicks didn't object. The Reverend had already performed a quiet ceremony, not the wedding I'd imagined as a little girl, but a simple exchange of vows in their parlor, with just the four of us present. I was legally married to both Jacob and Elias Gable, though I still felt more like a guest than a wife. It was on a Thursday evening in December when I finally understood that the ground beneath my feet had shifted completely. Had made pot roast for supper, and we were sitting in the parlor afterward, Jacob reading aloud from the newspaper while Elias worked on a crossword puzzle. Snow was starting to fall outside, and I mentioned that I should probably check on Mrs. Hicks. Make sure she had enough firewood stacked for the storm that was coming. That's when they both went very ill, and Jacob folded the newspaper with careful, deliberate movements. Elias set down his pencil and looked at me with those blue eyes that suddenly seemed much more serious than usual. Jacob cleared his throat and reminded me that I was a married woman now, that my place was with my husband's, not running back to tend to people who'd never really cared about me anyway. Elias added, his voice gentle but firm, that it wouldn't be proper for a wife to be gallivanting around town, especially not in weather like this. What would people think? I started to protest, to explain that Mrs. Hicks was old and alone, but Jacob held up his hand and shook his head. They'd already sent word and money to hire the Peterson boy to check on her and bring her whatever she needed. They'd taken care of everything just like they always did, just like they always would. That's when I heard it, the soft click of the front door lock turning. Jacob had reached over, casually, almost absently, and turned the key while he was talking. When I looked at him with confusion, he smiled. That same warm smile I'd grown to love, and told me it was for my own safety, that the roads were getting icy and it was dangerous to be out after dark. But the key disappeared into his pocket, and for the first time since I'd climbed Mockingbird Hill, I realized I had no idea where I was standing in this strange new geography of my life. Winter settled over Mockingbird Hill like a heavy quilt, and with it came a quiet that seemed to press against the windows and seep through the walls. The snow kept falling day after day until the world outside looked like a blank page, waiting for someone to write a story on it. But inside that house, a different kind of story was being written, one I wasn't sure I wanted to be part of anymore. It started with small things that seemed reasonable when they explained them. The roads were too dangerous for visitors, so the grocery deliveries would come only once a week. Now, the telephone had been having trouble with the lines. Something about the weight of the ice, so incoming calls weren't getting through properly. It was better, they said, to just focus on each other for a while, to really learn how to be a family without outside distractions. But what they didn't tell me, what I had to figure out on my own, was that being their wife meant something different than I'd ever imagined. They needed me, they said, in ways that other husbands might not. They'd been alone for so long, had been denied the kind of love that other men took for granted. Now that they had me, now that I was truly theirs, they wanted to make up for all those years of loneliness. The first time it happened, I told myself it was natural. We were married after all, and this was what married people did. Jacob was gentle, asking permission with his eyes, even when his hands were trembling with want. Elias whispered poetry while he waited his turn, his voice soft and reverent like he was praying. They took care of me afterward, brought me warm milk and honey, told me how beautiful I was, how lucky they were to have found me. Then it happened again before bedtime, and again the next morning before breakfast, and again after lunch while I was trying to read. What had felt like love and longing started to feel like something else entirely, like hunger that could never be satisfied, like thirst that only grew stronger with each drink of water. They began to plan their days around it, talking to each other in whispers about whose turn it was, when would be the best time, whether I seemed too tired or if I might be willing. I stopped being whisper and became something else, a thing they shared, a possession they took turns enjoying, a solution to a problem I'd never fully understood. I tried to talk to them about it once, tried to explain that I needed time to rest, to think, to just be myself for a while. Jacob looked hurt, his brown eyes filling with a kind of disappointment that made my chest ache. Elias got very quiet and asked if I was unhappy with them, if they'd done something wrong, if maybe I was regretting our marriage already. They reminded me of all they'd given me, the beautiful house, the fine clothes, the security I'd never had before. They told me about their loneliness, about the years they'd spent watching other men court women and marry and start families while they remained hidden away like shameful secrets. Wasn't it selfish of me? They wondered, to deny them the one thing that made them feel normal, the one thing that proved I truly loved them both, so I stopped protesting. Learned to smile when they reached for me. To make the right sounds at the right times, to pretend that my body belonged to me when it clearly belonged to them. I became an actress in my own life, playing the role of the willing wife while something inside me grew smaller and quieter with each performance. The worst part wasn't the frequency or the expectation. It was the way they made it seem like love. They brought me gifts afterward, little tokens of appreciation that felt more like payment than affection. They praised me constantly, told me how good I was, how perfect, how lucky they were. They made me complicit in my own disappearance by convincing me that this was what I wanted, what I'd agreed to. When I said yes to their proposal, by February, I realized I hadn't seen the outside world in over 2 months. The snow had melted and frozen and melted again. But I knew this only from watching through windows that might as well have been paintings for all the good they did. I hadn't spoken to another human being besides Jacob and Elias since Christmas. And I was starting to forget what my own voice sounded like when it wasn't responding to their needs and demands. That's when I found the other lock, the one on the back door that I'd never noticed before because I'd never had reason to try that door. And the ones on the windows that didn't open no matter how hard I pushed. And the telephone that when I finally got up the courage to pick it up while they were sleeping had no dial tone at all. I stood in their kitchen at 3 o'clock in the morning, still wearing the nightgown Jacob had bought me because it was prettier than that old thing I'd brought from Mrs. Hendricks's house, and finally understood what had happened to me. I wasn't a wife. I wasn't even a person anymore. I was a prisoner who'd unlocked her own cell and handed over the key. With a smile. Spring came late that year, but when it finally arrived, it brought with it a restlessness I couldn't shake. The snow melted away to reveal a world I'd almost forgotten existed. Green grass pushing through the brown earth. Birds building nests in the eaves of the house. The smell of things growing and changing carried on the wind that rattled the locked windows. Found myself standing at those windows for hours, my palms pressed against the glass like I could somehow push my way through to the other side. Jacob and Elias noticed my mood. Course they noticed everything about me now. Oh, I ate how I slept, when I smiled and when I didn't. They started planning special activities to cheer me up, they said. Jacob suggested we plant a garden together, something to give me a project to focus on. Elias thought I might enjoy redecorating the guest room, maybe picking out new curtains from the catalog since I seemed to enjoy looking out windows so much. But what they were really doing was giving me busy work, little tasks to fill the empty hours between their demands on my body. They'd learned to space things out better to make it seem less obvious, but the schedule was still there. Morning, afternoon, evening, and sometimes once more before bed if they were feeling particularly needy. I'd started marking the days on a calendar I kept hidden in my dresser drawer using tiny pencil marks that looked like nothing more than random scratches. Times a day had become the standard, and I was keeping count like a prisoner marking time on a cell wall. The garden project gave me my first taste of outside air in months, but even that came with conditions. Could work in the dirt for an hour each morning, but only while they sat on the porch watching. Could choose what vegetables to plant, but only from the seeds they'd already purchased. I could pull weeds and water the rows, but I couldn't go near the fence line that bordered their property, couldn't walk down the path that led toward the road. It was while I was planting tomatoes that I saw him. Tom Fletcher, the young man who delivered groceries from Abernathy's store in town. He couldn't have been more than 18 or 19, with sandy hair and freckles across his nose that made him look even younger. He was loading crates from his truck, moving with the easy confidence of someone who'd never had to question whether the ground beneath his feet was solid. Watched him from behind the bean poles, my heart hammering so hard I was sure Jacob and Elias could hear it from the porch. Tom Fletcher represented something I'd almost forgotten existed. The possibility of connection to the world beyond this hill. Proof that other people still moved freely through their lives while I remained trapped in this strange theater of marriage and captivity. When he glanced toward the garden and saw me there, he raised his hand in a casual wave. I looked back toward the porch where my husband sat, watching, then lifted my own hand just slightly, barely more than a twitch of my fingers. But Tom smiled anyway, and that smile felt like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. That night, while Jacob and Elias discussed whether we needed more fertilizer for the garden, I excused myself to use the bathroom and instead crept to the front window to see if Tom's truck was still there. It was gone, of course, but sitting on the porch rail was a small paper bag with our weekly order receipt tucked under it. My hands shook as I imagined walking down that path, picking up that bag, maybe finding some excuse to walk a little further just to see how far I could go before someone stopped me. But I knew better than to try. They'd made it clear, without ever saying it directly, that my safety depended on staying close to home. The world was dangerous for a woman alone, especially a woman in my delicate condition. Though what that condition was exactly they never specified. It was just understood that I needed their protection, their constant vigilance, their never-ending supervision. The deliveries came every Thursday, and I started timing my garden work to coincide with Tom's visits. Nothing dramatic, nothing that would raise suspicion, just the chance to see another human face, to remember that I wasn't the only person left in the world. Sometimes he'd wave again. Sometimes he'd call out a greeting that carried across the yard like a message in a bottle. Always I'd feel Jacob and Elias watching from the porch, their attention sharp as hawks circling prey. It was during the third week of Tom's visits that I noticed something different. He seemed to linger longer than necessary, taking extra time to check items off his list, reorganizing crates that didn't need reorganizing. And when he looked toward the garden where I was weeding the bean rows, his expression wasn't just friendly anymore. It was concerned. I must have looked different than I had 6 months ago. Thinner maybe despite the regular meals, paler from spending so much time indoors. There were shadows under my eyes that no amount of sleep seemed to fix, and my clothes hung on me differently than they used to. When you live with someone every day, the changes are gradual, invisible. But to someone seeing you once a week, the decline would be obvious. That Thursday, while Jacob dozed in his chair and Elias was absorbed in a book, Tom did something he'd never done before. Instead of just waving, he pointed to the shed near the edge of the garden and mouthed a single word I could read on his lips. "Help!" I glanced back at the porch, my heart racing, then shook my head quickly and turned back to my weeding with hands that trembled so badly I could barely hold the tools. But inside my chest, something that had been sleeping for months began to stir awake. Someone had noticed. Someone was asking questions. And for the first time since winter, I allowed myself to wonder what might happen if I answered them. The weeks that followed Tom's silent question felt like living with a secret bomb in my chest, something that could explode at any moment and change everything. I started paying attention to details I'd been too numb to notice before. The way Jacob always positioned himself between me and the front door when we heard Tom's truck coming up the hill. Elias would suddenly need help with something that required my immediate attention whenever the delivery was being made. They had been managing my interactions with the outside world so carefully that I'd stopped thinking of it as management at all. It just seemed natural that they would handle the business with Tom, that they would count the groceries and check the receipt while I stayed safely in the garden or the kitchen. But now I understood it for what it was: control disguised as protection, isolation wrapped up in the pretty bow of concern for my well-being. I started testing the boundaries in small ways. Nothing dramatic enough to raise alarms, but enough to confirm what I already suspected. When I mentioned that I missed talking to other people, Jacob reminded me that I had both of them to talk to, that most wives didn't have the luxury of two husbands who hung on their every word. When I wondered aloud about writing a letter to Mrs. Hicks, Elias gently pointed out that she'd never really cared about me anyway, and wouldn't it be painful to reach out only to be ignored? They had an answer for everything, a reason why every impulse I had toward the outside world was either dangerous or unnecessary or just plain foolish. They'd built a cage so perfect that I'd helped design it myself, brick by brick, choice by choice, until I couldn't see the bars anymore. But Tom Fletcher had made me see them. And once you notice the cage, you can't stop noticing it. Started paying attention to how they moved together, how they anticipated each other's needs and reactions. When Jacob wanted to touch me, Elias would find some excuse to look away or busy himself with a book. When Elias needed his turn, Jacob would suddenly remember chores that required his attention elsewhere, as if they could somehow give each other privacy in a body they shared. I realized they'd developed elaborate systems for managing not just me but themselves and their own complicated relationship with possession and desire. The grocery deliveries became my lifeline to sanity. The one event each week that reminded me there was still a world beyond these walls. Started timing everything around Thursday mornings. When I washed my hair, when I wore my blue dress that brought out my eyes, when I worked in the part of the garden that was most visible from the driveway. Told myself I was just trying to look nice, to feel human again. But deep down I knew I was sending signals, like a lighthouse sending out beams into the darkness. Tom started leaving things. Nothing obvious. Nothing that would be noticed by anyone who wasn't looking for them. A penny on the porch rail that hadn't been there before. A small stone placed just so on the garden gate. A wild flower tucked under the corner of the grocery receipt. Tiny signs that he was thinking about me, that he was paying attention, that someone in the world still saw me as a person worth noticing. I never responded directly, never left signs in return. The risk was too great, and I'd learned to be afraid of my own shadow by then. But I started positioning myself where he could see me better during his deliveries. Started making eye contact that lasted a few seconds longer than politeness required. And once, when Jacob and Elias were both distracted by an argument about something they'd read in the newspaper, I pressed my hand to my throat and shook my head slightly. Gesture so small it could have been brushing away a mosquito, but unmistakable if you were looking for it. Tom's eyes went wide, and he nodded once quickly before turning back to his truck. That night, lying between my two husbands while they slept, the deep sleep of satisfaction, I allowed myself to imagine what it would be like to walk down that hill, to climb into Tom's delivery truck, to feel the wind through the open windows as we drove away from Mockingbird Hill and back into the world of normal people living normal lives. But imagination was dangerous territory, and I'd learned to keep my dreams small and quiet. Still, something had changed in me that day when Tom saw my silent plea for help. For the first time in months, I'd communicated with another. Human being without Jacob and Elias controlling every word, managing every interaction, deciding what was safe for me to say and think and feel. It was such a small act of rebellion that anyone else would have laughed at its insignificance. But for me it felt like striking a match in a cave. A tiny flame that might not light the way out, but at least proved that fire was still possible. The next Thursday, Tom brought more than groceries. Hidden in the bottom of the egg carton, underneath the cardboard divider, was a folded piece of paper no bigger than a postage stamp. It in pencil so light I had to hold it up to the window to read. It were 4 words that made my knees go weak. Are you in danger? I stared at that paper until the words blurred together, then quickly tore it into pieces so small they looked like nothing more than lint when I scattered them in my dresser drawer. But those 4 words echoed in my head for days afterward, bouncing around like birds trapped in an attic. Was I in danger? They'd never hit me, never threatened me with violence. They fed me well, dressed me nicely, told me constantly how much they loved me, but love that came with locks and isolation and demands that never ended. Was that love at all, or was it something else? Wearing love's mask. For the first time since I'd climbed Mockingbird Hill, I had to answer a question that someone else was asking instead of just accepting the answers that Jacob and Elias provided for everything. And the answer, when I finally admitted it to myself, made my whole body shake like I was coming down with fever. Yes, I was in danger. But the danger wasn't just to my body. It was to my soul, my mind, my memory of who I used to be before I became nothing more than a thing they shared between them. The summer heat settled over Mockingbird Hill like a wool blanket, thick and suffocating, making everything feel slower and more oppressive than usual. The garden I'd planted in spring was thriving, but I barely noticed the tomatoes ripening or the beans climbing their poles. All my attention was focused on Thursdays, on the 10 minutes each week when Tom Fletcher's truck appeared in our driveway, and I remembered what hope felt like. His next message came wrapped around a cucumber, a thin strip of paper that I almost missed completely. This time he'd written an address, 412 Maple Street, and underneath it, in that same careful pencil, safe place. Tell me when. I memorized those words before destroying the paper, repeating them like a prayer while I went through the motions of my daily routine. 412 Maple Street. Safe place. Tell me when. Address meant nothing to me. I'd been away from town so long that I'd lost track of who lived where. But the promise of safety was like water to someone dying of thirst. But when was the problem? Every moment of my day was counted for now. Every movement watched and catalogued and managed. Jacob and Elias had developed a routine so precise it felt like living inside a clock. Each hour predetermined and inescapable. Morning duties, afternoon rest, evening obligations, nighttime demands. They never left me alone long enough to walk to the mailbox, much less plan any kind of escape. An escape was what I was thinking about now, though I'd never used that word before. I'd been telling myself I just wanted to visit town, to see other people, to have normal conversations about normal things. But Tom's messages had forced me to name what I really wanted. Freedom, the right to make my own choices, to come and go as I pleased, to say no when I meant no and have that word respected. The heat made everything worse. Jacob and Elias seemed to need me more frequently during the long, sweltering afternoons, when there was nothing else to do but seek whatever comfort they could find. The house had no air conditioning, just fans that pushed the thick air around without cooling it, and the windows that might have provided cross breezes remained locked tight. I found myself counting the hours until sunset, then counting the hours until sunrise, marking time like a prisoner serving a sentence with no end date. It was during one of those suffocating July afternoons that I discovered something that changed everything. Jacob had fallen asleep in his chair after lunch, and Ellis was dozing too. Their shared body heavy with heat and the kind of satisfaction that comes after taking what you want. I was clearing the lunch dishes when I noticed that Jacob's pants pocket was gaping open, and inside I could see the outline of keys, not just the house. I'd seen those before when he locked and unlocked doors. These were different, smaller, and there were more of them than I'd realized. My heart started racing as I understood what I was looking at. Keys to every lock in the house, maybe even keys to things I didn't know were locked. I stood there for what felt like hours but was probably only seconds, staring at those keys and trying to work up the courage to reach for them. If I was caught, there would be questions I couldn't answer, suspicions I couldn't deflect. But if I didn't try, I might never get another chance. Moving as carefully as if I was defusing a bomb, I slipped 2 fingers into Jacob's pocket and eased out the keyring. There were 7 keys total. 3 I recognized as belonging to the front door, back door, and windows, but 4 others I'd never seen before. What else in this house was locked? What other freedoms had been taken away so gradually that I'd never even noticed their absence? I was still holding the keys when Elias stirred and opened his eyes. For a moment we just stared at each other, and I saw something flicker across his face. Not anger exactly, but a kind of resigned sadness, like he'd been expecting this moment and dreading it in equal measure. He looked at the keys in my hand, then at his brother still sleeping in the chair, then back at my face with those blue eyes that had once seemed so kind and now felt like searchlights. When he spoke, his voice was barely a whisper, but every word hit me like a physical blow. He told me he understood why I might be curious about those keys, why a young woman might feel restless and want to explore. But he reminded me that some doors were locked for good reasons, that some freedoms were dangerous for people who didn't understand the world the way they did. He'd seen what happened to girls who went looking for trouble, who thought they knew better than the men who loved them and wanted to protect them. Then he held out his hand, palm up, waiting for me to return what I'd taken. I stood there holding those keys, feeling the weight of them in my palm like I was holding my own future. This was the moment, the choice between safety and freedom, between the known misery of my current life and the unknown risks of whatever lay beyond those locked doors. Everything that happened next would depend on what I did in the next few seconds. But Elias was still waiting, still watching me with that patient expression that said he knew I would make the right choice, the safe choice, the choice that kept his world exactly as he needed it to be. And Jacob was starting to stir in his chair, his eyelids fluttering as he began to wake from his nap. I closed my fingers around the keys and felt the metal edges bite into my palm. For the first time in months, I was holding something that could change everything. The question was whether I had the courage to use it. I placed those keys back in Jacob's pocket that afternoon, my hands shaking so badly, I nearly woke him in the process. But something had shifted inside me during those few seconds when I held them. Something that couldn't be locked away again, no matter how tightly they controlled everything else. For the first time since I'd become Mrs. Gable, I'd made a choice. Even if that choice was to wait for a better moment, a safer opportunity. Elias never mentioned what had happened, but I caught him watching me differently after that day. Not with suspicion exactly, but with the kind of careful attention you give to something that might break or run away when you're not looking. He started finding excuses to stay closer to me during the day, suggesting we read together in the same room, asking for help with tasks that didn't really require assistance. The invisible leash they'd always kept on me grew shorter and tighter, but I'd learned something important about their system of control. Depended on my cooperation, my willingness to accept their version of reality, my belief that I was safer with them than without them. Once I stopped believing that, once I started questioning every kindness and examining every restriction, their power over me began to crack like ice in spring. I started paying attention to the rhythms of the house in ways I never had before. When they slept most deeply, when they were most distracted, when their guard was down, I noticed that Jacob's breathing changed when he was truly asleep versus when he was just resting his eyes. I learned that Elias could fall into such deep concentration while reading that he barely noticed what was happening around him. Memorized which floorboards creaked and which doors squeaked when opened. Most importantly, I started preparing myself mentally for what felt like an impossible task. Communicating with Tom Fletcher in a way that would let him know I needed help without alerting Jacob and Elias to what I was planning. Every Thursday I rehearsed different scenarios in my mind, different ways I might signal distress or slip him a message. But every plan seemed too risky, too likely to end in discovery and consequences I didn't want to imagine. It was late August when opportunity finally presented itself in the most unexpected way. Jacob had been feeling poorly for several days. Nothing serious, just a summer cold that left him sluggish and congested. Elias was worried enough to suggest they skip their usual afternoon routine with me, that they should both rest until Jacob felt better. It was the first time in months that I had an entire afternoon without their constant attention and demands. I spent that first hour of unexpected freedom just sitting in the kitchen, marveling at the silence, at the ability to think my own thoughts without interruption. But then I heard Tom's truck coming up the hill a day early because of some mix-up with the delivery schedule, and I knew this was the moment I'd been waiting for. Jacob and Elias were both dozing in the bedroom, the sound of Jacob's congested breathing masking any small noises I might make. My hands were trembling as I tore a piece of paper from the back of a recipe book and wrote 4 words in the tiniest handwriting I could manage. Help me get out. I folded the paper until it was no bigger than a pill, then slipped outside through the kitchen door, my heart hammering so loud I was sure it would wake the whole house. Tom was unloading crates from his truck, moving with his usual efficiency, but when he saw me approaching, actually walking toward him instead of just watching from the garden, his eyes went wide with surprise. I pretended to examine the vegetables he was unpacking, keeping my voice casual and quiet as I thanked him for coming early, mentioned that we were running low on a few things. But when I handed him the payment envelope, I made sure the tiny folded paper was pressed between the bills, hidden where only someone who was looking for it would find it. Tom's fingers brushed mine as he took the envelope, and for just a moment our eyes met. I saw understanding there and determination and something that looked like anger on my behalf. He nodded once, almost imperceptibly, then continued with his work as if nothing had happened. I was back in the kitchen within 5 minutes, washing vegetables and starting dinner preparations like I'd never left. When Jacob and Elias woke up an hour later, I was humming while I worked, appearing more content than I'd seemed in weeks. They commented on my improved mood, pleased that their afternoon of rest had apparently been good for all of us. But inside I was counting hours and days, calculating how long it would take Tom to figure out what to do with my message, wondering if 412 Maple Street was really as safe as he'd promised, trying to imagine what my life might look like if I ever made it off Mockingbird Hill alive. That night, lying between my sleeping husbands, I allowed myself to do something I hadn't done in almost a year. I prayed not the careful, grateful prayers I'd been taught to offer for my food and shelter and the generous men who provided for me, but the desperate bargaining kind of prayer that comes from the deepest part of your soul when you're running out of hope. I prayed for courage. I prayed for opportunity. I prayed that someone somewhere was listening to a trapped girl's whispered pleas for deliverance. And for the first time in months I prayed that I would live long enough to see what freedom felt like again. The next Thursday didn't come. Tom's truck never appeared in our driveway, and by afternoon, Jacob and Elias were both agitated in ways I'd never seen before. They kept looking out the windows, checking and rechecking the calendar, wondering aloud what could have happened to delay the delivery. Jacob suggested maybe Tom was sick or his truck had broken down. Elias wondered if there might have been some kind of accident on the mountain roads. But I knew better. Knew that my tiny folded message had reached its destination, and that somewhere in town people were asking questions that Jacob and Elias didn't want answered. Friday came and went with no word from town. Saturday stretched endlessly, filled with the kind of tense silence that comes before storms. Jacob and Elias whispered to each other when they thought I couldn't hear, their voices low and urgent in a way that made my skin crawl. They were planning something, making decisions about something, and I had the terrible feeling that I was the something they were discussing. Sunday morning, Jacob announced that we wouldn't be going to church. Something about the weather looking threatening, though the sky was clear as crystal. Instead, we would have our own service at home, just the three of us, the way God intended families to worship together. But what he really meant was that we wouldn't be leaving the house, wouldn't be seen by anyone who might ask uncomfortable questions about why I looked so thin and scared. By Sunday afternoon, I understood that my message hadn't just been received, had triggered something much bigger than I'd expected. Tom Fletcher hadn't just read my plea for help and decided to rescue me himself. He'd taken it to other people, people with authority, people who had the power to ask questions that Jacob and Elias couldn't deflect with charm and explanations. The realization hit me like a physical blow. I was about to be discovered, and they knew it. That's when their behavior changed completely. The gentle manipulation and careful control gave way to something much more direct and frightening. Jacob started checking and rechecking every lock in the house, testing windows that hadn't been opened in months, counting keys like a miser counting coins. Elias began moving our food supplies to different locations, hiding things in places that would take time to find, preparing for what looked like a siege. They explained it to me carefully, patiently, the way you might explain a difficult concept to a slow child. There were people in town who didn't understand our situation, who might try to interfere with our marriage based on ignorance and prejudice. These people thought they knew what was best for me, but they'd never taken the time to see how happy I was, how well cared for, how much my husbands loved and cherished me. If anyone came asking questions, Jacob said, I needed to remember that I was here by choice, that I was a willing and grateful wife, that any suggestion otherwise was insulting to all three of us. Elias added that some people might try to trick me, might claim they were there to help when really they just wanted to cause trouble for our family. But underneath their careful explanations, I could hear the threat that had always been there, just hidden beneath layers of kindness and concern. They would not let me go, ever. And if anyone tried to take me away from them, there would be consequences that none of us wanted to face. Monday morning brought the sound I'd been both hoping for and dreading. Vehicles coming up our hill. Not just Tom's delivery truck, but other cars, official-sounding engines that meant business. I was in the kitchen making breakfast when I heard them, and I dropped the plate I was holding, watching it shatter on the floor like my nerves had finally shattered after months of careful control. Jacob appeared in the doorway instantly, as if he'd been waiting for this moment. His face was calm, but his eyes held a wildness I'd never seen before. And when he spoke, his voice was steady as stone. He told me that whatever happened next, I needed to remember that I belonged with them, that I was safe with them, that the world outside would never understand or accept what we had together. He reminded me of all the times they'd protected me, provided for me, loved me when no one else cared whether I lived or died. The sound of car doors slamming echoed across the yard, followed by heavy footsteps on the porch stairs. Multiple voices, men's voices, calling out official-sounding words about warrants and investigations and welfare checks. Elias took my hand in both of his blue eyes filled with something that looked like goodbye. He whispered that no matter what anyone told me, no matter what they promised or threatened, I needed to remember that love sometimes looked different than people expected, and that real love meant never giving up on the people who needed you most. The pounding on the front door was loud enough to rattle the windows, and a voice I didn't recognize was shouting about having legal authority to enter the premises, about conducting an official investigation into reports of an endangered person. Jacob reached for his keys, but instead of unlocking the door, he double-checked that every lock was secure. We stood there in the hallway, the three of us who had become something twisted and unrecognizable. Over the course of almost 3 years, listening to the sounds of rescue and reckoning finally arriving at our door, I realized I was crying. But I couldn't tell if the tears were from relief or terror, because as much as I wanted to be saved, as much as I'd prayed for this moment, I also knew that once that door opened, everything would change in ways I couldn't predict or control. The girl who had climbed Mockingbird Hill at 16 was gone forever. But maybe, just maybe, the woman who was about to walk back down it could still find a way to live. The pounding stopped suddenly, and in the silence that followed, I heard something that made my knees weak. Tom Fletcher's voice. But not alone. He was talking to someone else. Someone with authority in his words and purpose in his step. Through the thin walls I caught fragments of their conversation. Pieces of a plan that had been forming while I'd been trapped in my own desperate world. Tom hadn't just read my message and acted alone. He'd taken it to Sheriff Franklin, yes, but he'd also shown it to someone else. His Aunt Martha, who worked at the county courthouse and knew things about legal procedures and women's rights that most folks in Iron Kettle had never considered. More importantly, Martha Fletcher had been keeping records, documenting deliveries to our house, noting the strange requests and the increasing isolation, building a case that no one could dismiss as gossip or speculation. What I didn't know, what Jacob and Elias didn't know either, was that there had been other girls before me, not many and not recently, but enough to establish a pattern that had caught the attention of people who made it their business to notice such things. The Gable family had been making arrangements like ours for 3 generations, and Martha Fletcher had been quietly collecting evidence of it for 20 years. Sheriff Franklin's voice came through the door then, calm and professional, explaining that they had a court order to conduct a welfare check, that this was a routine matter that could be resolved quickly and peacefully if everyone cooperated. But Jacob and Elias weren't listening to the reasonable words. They were hearing something else entirely, the sound of their carefully constructed world beginning to crumble. That's when Elias did something that shocked me more than anything that had happened in the past 3 years. He looked at his brother, then at me, and in a voice so quiet I almost missed it. He told Jacob to give me the keys. Jacob stared at him like he'd lost his mind. But Elias kept talking, his words coming faster now, more urgent. He said they both knew this day would come eventually, that they'd always known they were living on borrowed time. He said they'd had almost 3 years of something most men never got at all. And maybe that was enough. Maybe it was time to let me go before someone got hurt. But Jacob wasn't ready to surrender. His face went dark. And when he spoke, his voice carried a hardness I'd never heard before. He reminded Elias that I belonged to both of them, that I'd made vows before God and the state, that no one had the right to break up a legal marriage just because they didn't approve of it. The argument that followed was unlike anything I'd witnessed between them before. For 3 years they'd moved together like parts of the same machine, anticipating each other's needs, sharing thoughts and desires with an intimacy that had excluded everyone else. But now faced with the possibility of losing control completely, they were revealed as 2 separate men with 2 very different ideas about what love meant and how far they were willing to go to keep it. Sheriff Franklin was getting impatient. Outside, his voice taking on the kind of edge that suggested he was prepared to stop asking politely and start making demands. I could hear other voices too. Tom Fletcher, Martha Fletcher, and at least 2 other men who sounded like they'd dealt with situations like this before. Elias reached for me then, his hands gentle on my shoulders, his blue eyes filled with something that looked almost like relief. He told me he was sorry that he'd never meant for things to go as far as they had, that somewhere along the way they'd stopped protecting me and started protecting themselves from the fear of losing me. He said the word that Jacob couldn't go. I looked between them, these 2 men who had controlled every aspect of my life for so long that I'd almost forgotten I was capable of making my own decisions. Jacob was still clutching his keys, still believing he could keep the world at bay with locks and determination. But Elias was holding out his hand, offering me a choice I'd thought was lost forever. When I took his hand instead of waiting for Jacob's permission, something inside my chest that had been locked up tight finally broke open. I walked to the front door with legs that felt like they belonged to someone else, reached for the lock with fingers that shook so badly I could barely turn the mechanism. A door opened and sunlight flooded the hallway where I'd been standing in shadows for so long that I'd forgotten what brightness felt like. Sheriff Franklin stepped inside first, a man in his 50s, with kind eyes and the sort of steady presence that made you believe in justice again. Behind him came Tom Fletcher, looking younger and more nervous than I'd ever seen him, but determined in a way that reminded me there were still people in the world who did the right thing just because it was right. Sheriff Franklin asked if I was all right, if I needed medical attention, if I was free to leave if I chose to. His questions were simple, direct, requiring nothing more than yes or no answers that I gave in a voice so quiet he had to lean forward to hear me. But the most important question came last, and when he asked it, the whole world seemed to hold its breath, waiting for my answer. "Ma'am, are you here because you want to be?" I looked back, once at Jacob and Elias, still joined together in their shared body, but separated now by something deeper than flesh and bone. Jacob's face was filled with betrayal and rage. But Elias was crying, tears streaming down his cheeks as he nodded at me like he was giving me permission to save myself. "No, I whispered, and that single word echoed through the house like a gunshot. "No, I'm not." Walking out of that house and into Tom Fletcher's truck felt like being born again at 19 years old. The world beyond Mockingbird Hill was bigger and brighter and more frightening than I remembered. But it was mine again in a way it hadn't been since I was 16, and desperate enough to believe that any kind of love was better than none at. The legal proceedings took months to sort out. Turned out that what Jacob and Elias had done wasn't technically kidnapping since I'd married them willingly. But it wasn't legal marriage either, since Missouri law didn't actually recognize such arrangements. Despite what Reverend Morrison had claimed, I was what the lawyers called in limbo. Not quite a victim, not quite a criminal, just a young woman who'd made an impossible choice and lived with the consequences longer than anyone should have to. Martha Fletcher helped me find work at the courthouse, filing papers and answering phones and slowly learning how to live in the world again. Tom Fletcher helped too, though it took me 2 years before I could let him hold my hand without flinching. And 3 years before I could say yes when he asked me to marry him properly with just one groom and a future I got to help choose. I'm 81 years old now, and Tom's been gone 5 years come December. We had 43 good years together, raised 2 children who never knew the whole truth about how their parents met, built a life that was ordinary and precious in all the ways my first marriage never was. But I still think about Jacob and Elias sometimes. Wonder what happened to them after the law finished asking its questions, and the town finished gossiping about secrets that should have stayed buried. I heard they moved away, found some other place where 2 men sharing one body could live without quite so much scrutiny. I hope they learned something from what happened, though I suspect they probably just learned to be more careful about the kind of girl they chose next time. The thing about surviving something impossible is that it changes how you see everything else. Every choice I made after walking out of that house felt like a gift. Every ordinary day like a small miracle. Learned that love doesn't come with locks, that protection doesn't require imprisonment, that being wanted and being valued are 2 entirely different things. If my story has found its way to you tonight, wherever you're listening from, I hope it reminds you that it's never too late to choose yourself. Say no when no is what you mean, to walk toward the light even when you can't see what's waiting on the other side. Hope helps you remember that your voice matters. Your choices matter. Your life belongs to you and no one else. Shared this story because sometimes the bravest thing you can do is tell the truth about what survival really looks. It's not always pretty and it doesn't always make sense, but it's yours. And that, more than anything else, is what makes it worth fighting for. If you think there's someone out there who needs to hear these words, maybe you could help my voice find its way to them. Sometimes the most important conversations happen between strangers who understand that being human means looking out for each other even when we don't know each other's names. Tell me in the comments, what city are you watching this from? I'd love to know how far these old memories have traveled. The story continues in the next chapter in the next linked video. But first, I need you to subscribe to join the family, as we are looking forward to hit our first 10,000 subscribers target, and feel free to share your story in the comments. You matter, your voice does too.